Necromancer is one of the most complicated classes to tank with, but at the same time it's one of the strongest, so it feels extremely rewarding to play once you learn it. So whether you're drawn to it because of the Necromancer class fantasy, or simply looking for a strong class from a purely gameplay perspective, you're in the right place, because in this video I'll show you how to build and play a Necromancer tank in Elder Scrolls Online. Necromancers have the best damage mitigation out of all classes. They take 10% reduced damage thanks to Spirit Guardian, and 3% thanks to Bitter Harvest. Then on top of that, they gain 15% damage reduction for dots from the Disdain Harm passive. And the hardest boss fights in the game happen to be all about dots, which makes Necromancers one of the best choices. They have access to Glacial Colossus ultimate, which isn't the only source of major vulnerability, since Turning Tide and Archdruid exist, but it's still great because it allows your group to use different item sets in place of these two. And you'll be able to use this or any other ultimate a lot, thanks to Necrotic Potency, which allows you to consume corpses to gain ultimate, and it will also proc the corpse consumption passive, generating even more of it. You'll also have an easy time sustaining your resources in trash fights, or in any boss fight with lots of ads, thanks to the Death Gleaning passive, which restores a bit of your resources whenever a nearby enemy dies. I want this video to be useful for both beginners and experienced players, so I'll start with very basic stuff, but the video will have timestamps, so you can skip over that if I'm talking about something you already know. By the end of the video, you'll have a solid understanding of how to build and play an effective Necromancer tank, as well as know its strengths and weaknesses. So let's dive in and see what the Necro has to offer. I'll start off by showing you all the skills that can be useful, and then I'll show you how to set them up for different encounters. Starting off with Necromancer's 3 skill lines: Gravelord, Bone Tyrant, and Living Death. We're gonna start off with Bone Tyrant, as this skill line has the most useful abilities when it comes to tanking. Death Scythe, a 7-meter conal attack that heals you for 15% of your max health if it hits at least one enemy. And the heal is increased by 5% for each additional enemy, up to 5 times. So when hitting 6 enemies, you will heal for 40% of your max health, which is extremely strong. This ability is quite cheap when compared to similar self-heals, but it can also be very problematic. There will be fights where this requirement of having to hit an enemy will be troublesome, like for example in Cloudrest, when tanking the portal. If you're fetching orbs or when Smudge ports around, you'll have nothing to hit, making Death Scythe useless. So you have to be aware of this shortcoming, and bring another heal or damage shield as a supplement for these short windows when you can't hit anything. The Hungry Scythe morph is the default choice, as it will be better in a huge majority of situations. It reduces the cost by 270 magicka and grants you a 10-second heal over time that restores 6.2% of your max health every 2 seconds, if you hit at least a single enemy. The other morph, Ruinous Scythe, is very situational. It converts the cost to stamina and sets hit enemies off balance. Off balance debuff will be very important if your damage dealers are using the Exploiter champion point. In single target fights, this can be more easily taken care of by combination of elemental susceptibility and lightning elemental blockade. If your team needs it in AoE fights that are spaced out, such as the trash phases in the Navintas fight in Sunspire, you can use lightning elemental blockade combined with Sorcerer's Summon Charge Atronach ultimate. But if you need it for more constant trash fights, where your Sorc won't be able to generate enough ultimate every time, Ruinous Scythe becomes the best option. Keep in mind that your survivability and sustain are going to take a hit because of that. So it's only an option when you're not tanking anything difficult. Next we have Bone Armor, an ability that grants you Major Resolve for 20 seconds. This buff gives you 6000 armor, and it's absolutely crucial to have it up at all times as a tank. It has other sources. You can get it for example from the Balance skill or from a Warden teammate through Frostcloak, but Bone Armor is much better in most situations, because it generates a corpse when it expires, which translates to 6 ultimate once you sack it with Necrotic Potency. What the skill description doesn't tell you is that you can trigger the corpse generation early by recasting this ability once half of its duration has expired. So whenever you have nothing else to cast, and your Bone Armor's remaining duration is less than 10 seconds, you can recast it early to get a corpse. Paying attention to that can make you generate so much more ultimate than a Necro tank who doesn't do it. And it makes the gameplay much more fun because there's always something to click. The Beckoning Armor morph reduces the cost by 270 magicka and pulls enemies in and taunts them if they attack you from far away, once every 2 seconds. This can be good, but it can also be a detriment in some places. For example in Zalvaka fight. If your Beckoning Armor randomly pulls in a Watcher at the wrong time, it can perform its spin attack while another deadly mechanic is happening. killing your group members, which is why Rogrov is one of the places where you absolutely don't want to bring Beckoning Armor. Summoner's Armor is the safer option, as it won't do any shenanigans on its own, the way Beckoning Armor can. While active, it will reduce the cost of your Sacrificial Bones, Skeletal Mage, and Spirit Mender by 15%. Spirit Mender is something you'll be using in basically every fight, Sacrificial Bones is something you'll be using in easier fights to generate additional ultimate, and Skeletal Mage is something you'll be using super rarely. This is the morph you should be using, unless you know that Beckoning Armor won't cause issues in the content you're going into. Bitter Harvest allows you to consume up to 5 corpses around you to gain 2 ultimate, and healing for 4% of your max health every 1 second, for 2 seconds per corpse, and grants you a passive 3% damage reduction while slotted. Let me move straight to morphs. Necrotic Potency morph increases the ultimate gain per corpse from 2 to 6. This is the signature ability of Necromancer tank. You'll be generating so much more ultimate than other tanks if you manage your corpses correctly, and at the same time, if you manage them wrong, you won't be bringing much compared to other classes, which is why I said at the beginning that Necro tank is hard to play. You can generate corpses from Bone Armor every 10 seconds, from Spirit Mender every 8 or 4 seconds depending on the morph, from Sacrificial Bones every roughly 3 seconds, and from Skeletal Mage every 10 seconds. Additionally, consuming any corpse will trigger the Corpse Consumption passive, which grants you 10 ultimate and can be procced every 16 seconds. You can also consume corpses of your defeated enemies, so you'll generate a lot of ultimate in trash packs, or bosses with ads. Keep in mind that corpses don't stay on the ground forever. The ones produced by Bone Armor, Spirit Mender and Skeletal Mage last 10 seconds, and the one produced by Sacrificial Bones lasts only 6 seconds. So make sure to cast Necrotic Potency before they expire. The Dead and Pain morph increases the duration of the heal to 4 seconds per corpse, and grants you major protection for the duration, which decreases your damage taken by 10%. This isn't worth it because it greatly reduces your ultimate generation, defeating the whole point of bringing a Necromancer tank, and you can get major protection much more easily from just slotting Revealing Flare, which will also increase your Magicka recovery by 10%, thanks to the Magicka 8 passive, so it's straight up better. Bone Totem allows you to summon a totem at your feet for 11 seconds, that grants minor protection to your allies, which decreases their damage taken by 5%, and every 2 seconds, the totem will pulse, fearing enemies for 4 seconds. It's very unlikely you'll have the space to slot it, but it can be good in some niche situations, where you want to constantly stun small adds. If you end up using it, Agony Totem will last an additional 2 seconds, and will provide your allies with additional synergy, that deals damage equal to 1.8% of their higher resource, plus 189% of their weapon or spell damage, over 5 seconds, and applying minor vulnerability to enemies, increasing their damage taken by 5%. In terms of damage, it's a lot weaker than other synergies, which is why it isn't worth using it just for that. Use it only if you need the stun, or the AoE minor vulnerability. Bone Goliath Transformation Ultimate increases your max health by 30,000, heals you for 30,000, and causes your light attacks to restore 2% of your max health, and your heavy attacks to restore 5% of your max health for 20 seconds. It could save you in some of the older content, but most of the recent dungeons and trials have some sort of mechanic that deals damage based on max HP, so this ultimate will be extremely bad there. If you do end up using it, Ravenous Goliath is the better morph. It makes you deal damage around yourself, equal to 5% of your max HP, and heal you for that amount. Now, let's look at the passives in the Bone Tyrant skill line. Death Gleaning is something I already mentioned in the intro. You will restore 666 stamina and Magicka whenever a nearby enemy dies, which makes sustaining much easier in trash fights, or in boss fights that have lots of adds. Disdain Harm is also something I already mentioned. It will reduce your damage taken from dots by 15%, while you have a Bone Tyrant ability active, which will be procced by a Bone Armor most of the time. In rare situations where you don't use Bone Armor, it can also be triggered by the 10-second heal over time effect from Hungry Scythe. As I said before, it makes Necro extremely good because the hardest fights in the game happen to be all about dots. Health Avarice increases your healing receipt by 2% for each Bone Tyrant ability slotted, a very small but nice buff. Last Gasp increases your max health by 1250, which is also a nice bonus. Next up we have the Living Death skill line. Render Flesh allows you to heal yourself or a teammate in front of you for 15% of your max stamina or max Magicka, plus 157.5% of your weapon or spell damage, but it applies Minor Defile to you for 4 seconds, reducing your healing received and strength of damage shields by 6%. Other than the rare case of using this to help your teammates when they're struggling, this can also be used as your secondary heal, when there are no targets near you to utilize the Death Scythe. Though you need to actively look away from your teammates. to make sure it targets you, rather than them. The Resistant Flesh morph grants the target resistances equal to half of the amount healed. Despite the resistances being wasted on you, this is still the better morph no matter what, simply because the other morph is worse than the base ability. Blood Sacrifice consumes a corpse to heal a second target, and you absolutely do not want to waste a corpse on it. Expunge allows you to spend health to cleanse 2 negative effects from yourself. This is extremely handy because the universal cleanse removal skill that's available to all classes, Efficient Purge, costs a huge amount of magicka. Additionally, Expunge will reduce the cost of all your abilities by 3% while slotted, which affects ultimate costs. So combined with your ultimate generation, you can pump out ultimates even faster. Being able to purge negative effects will be super important in some fights, such as the Hunter-Killer Fabricant in Halls of Fabrication. In some fights it can be simply useful, although not completely necessary, like for example Lady Thorn in Castle Thorn. And in some fights it can be problematic, because for example in the Marcelok fight, purging a certain debuff that's on the tank will shoot out damaging projectiles at all other group members. Expunge and Modify restores 515 stamina and magicka for each negative effect removed. This is the better morph when you don't have to cleanse that many debuffs. Hexproof morph reduces the cost by 270 health and cleanses up to 4 negative effects. This is the better morph when there's lots of debuffs to cleanse. Spirit Mender allows you to summon a ghost for 16 seconds that heals you or the lowest health ally around you every 2 seconds for 3% of your max stamina or max magicka plus 31.5% of your weapon or spell damage. It creates a corpse on death, and just like Bone Armor, it can create it early if half of its duration has passed, so after 8 seconds. You'll also need it to trigger the Undead Confederate passive, which grants you 200 of all recoveries, and Near Death Experience, which increases crit chance of your healing based on target's missing health. The Spirit Guardian morph redirects 10% of the damage you take to the Spirit Guardian, which is a massive damage reduction. It has 30,000 health, so you'd have to take 300,000 damage to actually kill it with the redirected damage. It also slightly improves the heal. It now heals for 3.1% of your max stamina or max magicka, plus 32.5% of your weapon or spell damage. The 10% damage mitigation makes a massive difference, so this is the better morph for the majority of situations. The Intensive Mender morph has some niche use though. It increases the healing to 6.2% of your max stamina or max magicka, plus 65% of your weapon or spell damage, but halves the cost and duration. You'll be missing out on the damage mitigation, so it's not an option in any difficult fight, but in easier ones, you can use it to heal your teammates, and more importantly, generate more corpses, because with a duration of 8 seconds, you can recast it after 4 to generate an early corpse. Restoring Tether allows you to tether to a corpse to heal yourself and allies between you and the corpse for 20.9% of your max stamina or max magicka, plus 220.5% of your weapon or spell damage. It also increases your healing down by 3% while slotted. You want to avoid using it whenever it's possible, because spending a corpse on Restoring Tether means less corpses for necrotic potency, which means less ultimate. But it won't always be possible. Restoring Tether is a decent heal, and it gains other useful stuff when morphed. So in more difficult fights, you'll have to use it. The Mortal Coil morph is the better one if you end up using Restoring Tether. It restores 170 stamina and magicka every 2 seconds, which ends up ticking 6 times, so it restores 1020 stamina and magicka in total per cast. Reanimate is an expensive ultimate that allows you to instantly resurrect 3 group members. It's extremely good when your group is progressing a new type of content and deaths are unavoidable while you learn. If you do use it, you should go with the Renewing Animation morph. It will restore 5300 stamina and magicka for each player you attempt to resurrect, which can top off your resources when used on 3 dead players. Now, let's look at the passives in the Living Death skill line. Curative Curse increases your healing down by 8% whenever you have a negative effect on yourself, which is a nice bonus. Near Death Experience increases crit chance of your heals by up to 20% in proportion to target's missing health, while you have a Living Death ability slotted. A great passive that will help you bounce back from being almost dead. Corpse Consumption grants you 10 ultimates whenever you consume a corpse once every 16 seconds. It's a nice boost to your ulti generation, and you'll be proccing it plenty with necrotic potency. Undead Confederate increases all of your recoveries by 200, while you have Sacrificial Bonds, Skeletal Mage, or Spirit Mender active. And since you should have Spirit Mender active at all times, you'll benefit a lot from this passive. Next up we have the Gravelord skill line. Sacrificial Bones allows you to summon a skeleton which explodes after a moment, granting you a damage buff for your class and damage over time abilities. But this bit isn't important at all for us. The reason you'll want to sometimes use this ability as a tank is that it generates a corpse and can be recast pretty frequently. So if you already have Bone Armor and Spirit Mender on your skill bar, and the fight is easy enough so you don't need that many defensive skills, Sacrificial Bones is a great option to boost your ultimate generation even further. You'll want to use Gravelord Sacrifice Morph, as the other one changes the cost to stamina, which will be harder to sustain as a tank. But morphing this ability isn't that important, and you can just keep using the base Sacrificial Bones instead. Boneyard places an AoE on the ground that deals 13.3% of your max stamina or max magicka, plus 140% of your weapon or spell damage, as frost damage over 10 seconds. It can also consume a corpse to deal 30% more damage. An ally nearby can use the Grave Robber synergy to deal damage equal to 10% of their max stamina or max magicka, plus 105% of their weapon or spell damage, as frost damage in an AoE, and heal for that amount. It's a great ability. It can be used as a source of frost weakness if you're using the Elemental Catalyst item set, and you can spam it to constantly provide synergies to your allies, which deal decent damage and heal them. But you need to use it very cautiously, because it can consume a corpse to increase its damage, which is useless for you as a tank. So you'll want to cast it after using Necrotic Potency, to prevent that from happening. The Unnerving Boneyard morph also applies Major Breach to all enemies within it, reducing their armor by 6000. This is an extremely crucial buff that you need to have on all enemies. In single target fights, this will be taken care of by Pierce Armor or Elemental Susceptibility, but Unnerving Boneyard will be a great source of it in AoE fights. Skeletal Mage allows you to summon a mage for 20 seconds that attacks every 2 seconds. This is the worst out of your corpse generating abilities. So Bone Armor, Spirit Mender and Sacrificial Bones take priority. But if you happen to be in a rather easy fight and you want to push your ultimate generation to maximum, you can use it to boost it by just another bit. You'll want to use the Skeletal Arcanist morph, as the other one turns the cost into stamina, which will make it harder to sustain. Shocking Siphon allows you to tether to a corpse, dealing 20% of your max stamina or max magicka, plus 210% of your weapon or spell damage, over 20 seconds as shock damage. It also increases your damage done by 3% while slotted. This ability can be used as a source of shock weakness if you're using the Elemental Catalyst item set, but since it consumes a corpse, it will reduce your ultimate generation. You'll want to use the Mystic Siphon morph, because the other one, Detonating Siphon, changes the damage type to Disease, which makes it unable to proc Elemental Catalyst. This morph will also grant you 150 of all recoveries, while it's tethered to a corpse. The Frozen Colossus costs 175 ultimate points, and allows you to summon a Flesh Colossus to slam a big area 3 times, applying major vulnerability for 12 seconds with each hit, which increases enemies' damage taken by 10%. Since it slams 3 times, the duration ends up being 15 seconds. This debuff has only 2 other sources, Archdruid Deverick and Turning Tide item sets. Technically, there's also Kin March's Cruelty, but that's not reliable at all. Using this ultimate can allow your team to use different sets in place of Archdruid and Turning Tide. A single person using Frozen Colossus won't keep up major vulnerability on their own, but combined with Nazorai, used by someone else, it is possible. Especially since some boss fights are phase-based, such as for example the dragons in Sunspire. You have intermission phases during which you can replenish your ultimate. Keep in mind it has to be another group member using Nazorai. If you use it yourself, it will proc before your Colossus even manages to spawn and hit anything. You'll want to use the Glacial Colossus, as this morph increases the duration of the major vulnerability from 12 seconds to 17 seconds per hit, which ends up being 20 seconds, with all 3 hits. Now let's look at the passives in the Gravelord skill line. Reusable parts reduces the cost of your next Sacrificial Bones, Skeletal Mage, or Spirit Mender by 50% whenever one of these summons dies. It's a nice bonus to your sustain. Death Knell increases your critical strike chance against enemies under 25% health by 10% for each Gravelord ability slotted. It's not necessary for tanking. Take it only once you have skill points to spare. Dismember increases your penetration by 1500, while a Gravelord ability is active. Same as Death Knell, not necessary for tanking. Rapid Rot increases your damage done with dots by 10%, and just like 2 previous passives, it's not necessary. Now that we've covered class skill lines, let's move on to weapon skill lines. You'll only need 2 out of the 6 weapon skill lines. One-handed shield and the destruction staff. Let's start with the one-handed shield skill line. The first skill is Puncture, basically a melee taunt. It damages your target within 7 meters, causes them to attack you, and applies Major Breach, which reduces enemies' armor by almost 6000 for 15 seconds, providing around a 13% damage increase. This debuff is extremely crucial to have. Whenever you can't use Puncture for example because you're in a double ice staff setup, you'll have to make sure there's some other source of major breach. The morph you'll want to use here is Pierce Armor, which additionally provides minor breach, which reduces enemies' armor by another 3000. The other morph, Ransack, provides minor protection, which decreases your damage taken by 5%. Minor protection can also be passively obtained from the Temporal Guard ultimate, but if you want to bring two ultimates to choose between, you could instead get minor protection from Ransack. But the thing is, minor breach is extremely important, and it isn't that easy to keep up without Pierce Armor. So using Ransack is an option, but you need to be 100% sure that there's another reliable source of minor breach. It's also worth noting that you can modify Puncture with the Puncturing Remedy set, so that each cast of Puncture will heal you for 14% of your max health. Next skill is Low Slash. The base skill only provides minor maim, which can easily be obtained from other sources, so it's not particularly useful. However, its morph, Heroic Slash, is much more valuable. It not only applies minor maim, but also provides minor heroism to you for 15 seconds, allowing you to gain 10 ultimate per cast, allowing you to cast your ultimate more frequently. It's best to compare it with Sacrificial Bones, because that's the skill it's going to be competing with for the skill slot, whenever you're in a fight easy enough for you to focus more on the ulti generating, rather than on surviving. Sacrificial Bones is 6 ultimate per cast, and it can be cast roughly every 3 seconds, while Heroic Slash is 10 ultimate per cast, but it can be cast only once every 15 seconds. So Heroic Slash can be better if you have a free skill slot that you want to dedicate to an ultimate generating ability, but at the same time the fight isn't trivial enough for you to be able to constantly recast Sacrificial Bones. Another thing that works heavily in favor of Heroic Slash is the decisive weapon trait. The minor heroism from Heroic Slash will trigger it 10 times, while Sacrificial Bones' corpse, eaten up by necrotic potency, will only trigger it once. Additionally, you can craft potions that provide minor heroism with 100% uptime, but these require ingredients that drop from dragons, so the potions end up extremely expensive. For example, the average price of one on PC EU server right now is 4500 gold per potion, but if one day you're rich enough, you won't have to deal with the dilemma of trying to fit in Heroic Slash into your setup. The next skill is Defensive Posture, which grants you a damage shield equal to 31% of your max health for 6 seconds, and allows you to reflect one projectile that would hit you. This can be extremely useful in some encounters, such as the Locestis fight, where you can deal a lot of damage by just standing away from the dragon's melee range and constantly reflecting his frostbolts. Or for example the Daedros in Endless Archive. Reflecting their own firebolts back at them basically one-shots them. The damage shield is also great, since as a Necromancer, you don't have access to any class damage shield. There's only one good morph, Defensive Stance, which reduces the cost of your block and increases your block mitigation by 10%. It's gonna be crucial for some fights, where there's lots of blockable direct damage. It's also worth noting that you can amplify it with the Defensive Position set, so that each cast of Defensive Stance will restore Magicka. And the last useful skill from this skill line is Power Bash. This ability doesn't do anything interesting, but it will be required for proccing the Void Bash 2-piece item set, which is great for trash fights, and makes stacking enemies a lot faster. It doesn't matter which morph you choose here, and honestly you might as well not waste a skill point and leave it unmorphed. Now let's move on to passives. Fortress reduces the stamina cost of your one-hand and shield abilities by 15%, and reduces the cost of blocking by 36%, which is a massive decrease. Sword and Board increases your weapon and spell damage by 5%, which will boost your healing, and increases your block mitigation by 20%. Deadly Bash increases the damage of your bashes by 500, and reduces their cost by 50%. It's a nice bonus but low priority, so you can skip it if you're short on skill points. Deflect Bolts grant you another 14% additional block mitigation, but only against projectiles. Battlefield Mobility reduces the movement speed penalty of blocking by 36%, causing you to move faster than if you were blocking with a different weapon type. The other weapon skill line you'll need is Destruction Staff. Keep in mind that most of these abilities have different effects based on the type of the staff you're using, but I'll only be talking about Frost variants, because that's the type of staff you want to use as a tank. The first skill is Force Shock. While it's just a basic damaging ability, its morph, Crushing Shock, will be essential in some fights. This is because Crushing Shock can be used as a ranged interrupt, interrupting enemies who are channeling their abilities just like a bash, except it has a 28-meter range. This will be incredibly useful in fights where the enemy is channeling mechanics from far away, and you need to interrupt them quickly. The next skill is Wall of Elements, which is absolutely essential, and you'll always want to have it in your skill setup. It places an AoE in front of you for 10 seconds, which deals a tiny bit of damage, grants your allies a damage shield against projectiles, and applies 40% slow, and Minor Breach to enemies that are chilled. Minor Breach provides almost 3000 penetration, and we already talked about it when covering Pierce Armor. But the main reason why you'll need Wall of Elements in every skill setup is different. Every weapon skill applies enchantments of the weapon is being used with. You will want to use the Crusher enchantment on your Ice Staff, which combined with the Infused Weapon trait will reduce your enemy's armor by 2108 for 5 seconds, with a 5-second cooldown. Since Wall of Elements ticks every second, it will constantly proc Crusher whenever it's off cooldown, allowing you to provide 100% uptime on that armor debuff. You'll want to use the Elemental Blockade morph, which increases the size of the AoE and increases its duration from 10 to 15 seconds. But the other morph, Unstable Wall of Elements, also has some uses, and that's because it also provides the damage shield when it expires, so you can spam it to constantly apply a decent damage shield against projectiles to your teammates. This can be useful in, for example, the Black Rose Prison arena. Next useful skill is Destructive Touch, or rather its morph, Destructive Clench. This is one out of 2 range tones available in the game, and it's the usually better one. It has a 28 meter range and always applies the chilled status effect, which in turn applies Minor Maim for 4 seconds, and also Minor Brittle for 4 seconds, if you are wielding an Ice Staff. And it will also apply Minor Breach for 4 seconds, if your enemy is standing inside Wall of Elements. Minor Maim, as I said many times before, has many other sources, so it's not that important. Minor Brittle can be more easily provided by Arcanist's Rune of the Colorless pool, which lasts 5 times as long, but you won't always have an Arcanist in your group. Minor Breach provided by this ability can be useful if you're using double Ice Staff setup, and you don't have access to Minor Breach from Pierce Armor. The most important part of the skill, however, is that it applies Major Maim for 5 seconds, which decreases enemies' damage done by 10%. It's a massive boost to your and your team's survivability, and Major Maim doesn't have many other reliable sources, which is why Destructive Clench is so important. Next skill is Weakness to Elements, which applies Major Breach to your enemy for 30 seconds, which decreases their armor by almost 6000. It's the same debuff as the one applied by Puncture. The first morph is Elemental Drain, which extends the duration from 30 seconds to 60 seconds, and applies Minor Magicka Steal, which causes you and your allies to restore 168 Magicka every second, while attacking the affected enemy. Minor Magicka Steal is important, but it also gets applied by the Overcharge stats effect, which has a chance to be procced by any magic damage, which means that your damage dealers will most likely keep it up by themselves anyway, so it isn't that useful. The second morph is Elemental Susceptibility, which applies Burning, Chilled, and Concussed stats effects every 7.5 seconds. Burning applies a damage over time, which won't deal much damage with tank stats. Chilled applies Minor Maim, and additionally Minor Brittle for 4 seconds, if you're wielding an Ice Staff, and Minor Breach if the enemy is standing in Frost Wall of Elements. Concussed applies Minor Vulnerability for 4 seconds, which increases enemies' damage taken by 5%, and applies Off Balance if the enemy is standing in Lightning Wall of Elements. So, this skill will provide 53% uptime of Minor Vulnerability on its own, and also Minor Brittle if you're holding an Ice Staff. It's really difficult to explain when you should be using it, because there's so many variables here. It's a source of Major Breach, so you should use it if you're not using Puncture, and nobody else is providing Major Breach. But you can also provide it with the Unnerving Boneyard. Dragon Knight damage dealers can provide it with Noxious Breath, but you really want to have at least one Dragon Knight using its other morph, Engulfing Flames. So Noxious Breath is only an option with 2 or more Dragon Knight damage dealers. Another thing to consider is Minor Vulnerability and Minor Brittle can be applied by other members of your group. Wardens and Arcanists can take care of these debuffs and provide better uptime than you would with Elemental Susceptibility. But if they're absent in your team composition, then 53% uptime from Elemental Susceptibility is better than nothing. Another reason to use this skill could be providing consistent concussion in order to trigger lightning elemental blockades of balance. But this is only useful in very organized groups, because your damage dealers need to use the Exploiter champion point to make use of it, which isn't something people usually use by default. And the last useful skill from the skill line is Impulse. When activated, it causes an explosion around you, dealing frost damage and applying minor protection to your allies for 6 seconds, reducing their damage taken by 5%. Its morph, Pulsar, additionally inflicts minor mangle on small enemies, reducing their maximum health by 10%. This is extremely useful since as a tank, you're often the first to engage with enemies. By using Pulsar at the start of a fight, you can instantly shave off 10% of your enemy's health. It's important to note that this effect doesn't work against bosses and elite adds, but it shines in trash fights. Additionally, the Pulsar Morph triples the chance to proc stats effects. When combined with the charged trait on your ice staff, you'll have an almost 70% chance to proc the chilled stats effect on every enemy around you. This, in turn, synergizes with your Wall of Elements, since chilled enemies inside of it will get debuffed with Minor Breach, which reduces their armor by almost 3000, and a 40% movement speed reduction. As for Destruction Staff passives, it's important to note that you'll actually want to skip one of them. The Trifocus passive can actually be a detriment to your sustain. This passive causes your heavy attacks to grant you a damage shield, and makes your block cost magicka instead of stamina when wielding an ice staff. While the damage shield could be useful, the downside is that blocking with Trifocus completely stops your magicka recovery instead of your stamina recovery. And since most of your skills cost magicka, using Trifocus could result in a shortage of magicka and leave you with nothing to spend your stamina on. The Penetrating Magic passive causes your Destruction Staff abilities to ignore 2974 spell resistance, so it's not necessary for tanking. Elemental Force increases your chance to proc stats effects by 100%, and it's crucial to have. Ancient Knowledge will reduce your cost of blocking by 36% and increase your block mitigation by 20% while wielding an ice staff, turning it into a proper tanking weapon. Destruction Expert causes you to restore 3600 magicka whenever you get a killing blow with a Destruction Staff ability. It also causes you to restore 1800 magicka when you absorb damage with a Destruction Staff damage shield once every 10 seconds. You won't be getting many killing blows as a tank, so the first half of this passive is useless, but you'll be getting some magicka back from the damage shield you apply with Wall of Elements. Now, let's dive into the armor skill lines. These skill lines primarily consist of passives that scale with the number of armor pieces worn in each respective type. Additionally, they offer one active skill, which can only be used when wearing 5 or more armor pieces of the corresponding type. Let's start with light armor. You'll usually wear at least one light armor piece, so you'll benefit slightly from its passives. However, you won't need the active skill Annulment, since it requires wearing 5 light armor pieces. When it comes to passives, prioritize Evocation, which improves your magicka sustain, and Spell Warding, which increases your spell resistance. Once you have an abundance of skill points, you can also get Grace and Prodigy. Light armor also has inherent bonuses and penalties, regardless of skill point allocation. The bonuses are: each piece of light armor reduces damage taken from magical attacks by 1%. Magical damage types include Magic, Flame, Shock, and Frost. Each piece reduces the cost of dodge roll by 3%. And the penalties are: each piece increases damage taken from martial attacks by 1%. Martial types include Physical, Poison, Disease, and Bleed. And each piece increases the cost of block by 3%. Now, let's move on to medium armor. Similar to light armor, it's common to wear at least one piece of medium armor, providing you with some passive benefits. The active skill Evasion, specifically the Elude morph, can prove useful in certain encounters. For example, when off-tanking in Asylum Sanctorium. Evasion grants you major evasion, reducing damage taken from AoE attacks by 20%. Elude significantly extends this buff, and grants you major expedition for 3 seconds after being hit by a direct AoE attack, boosting your movement speed by 30%. Personally, I prefer using more heavy armor pieces and obtaining major expedition from a different skill, but Elude works exceptionally well, and can make you extremely fast when wearing 5 medium armor pieces. When it comes to passives, prioritize Windwalker, which enhances your stamina sustain, and Athletics, which reduces the cost of dodge roll and increases sprint speed. Dexterity and Agility are also valuable passives to invest in once you have an abundance of skill points. Medium armor also provides inherent bonuses, regardless of skill point allocation. The bonuses are: each piece of medium armor reduces the cost of block by 3%. And after using roll dodge, each piece reduces damage taken from AoE attacks by 2% for 2 seconds. Lastly, let's discuss heavy armor, which is our primary armor type. In most cases, you'll be wearing 5 heavy armor pieces, allowing you to really benefit from its passives. The active skill, Unstoppable, grants Major Resolve for 20 seconds, which increases your armor by 6000, although you'll most likely already have this buff from another source. It also provides 6 seconds of crowd control immunity. However, during the crowd control immunity, your movement speed is reduced by 65%. While the base ability, Unstoppable, isn't very useful, its morph, Immovable, is absolutely essential for certain encounters. One example is hard mode Zelvaka and Rogrove. The Immovable morph grants you 5% block mitigation per heavy armor piece equipped, and increases the strength of the snare by 5% per heavy armor piece. Both effects last 6 seconds, just like the crowd control immunity. So it's something you wanna use right before being hit with a powerful blockable attack. It's worth noting that if you were to use Immovable With a total of 7 heavy armor pieces, the snare strength would reach 100%, completely immobilizing you and preventing dodge rolling as well. When it comes to passives, you want to put points in all of them. Resolve grants you 343 bonus armor per heavy piece. Constitution grants you 4% health recovery per heavy piece, and restores 108 stamina and magicka per heavy piece when you get hit with a cooldown of 4 seconds. Juggernaut increases your max health by 2% per heavy piece. Revitalize increases the amount of stamina and magicka restored by your heavy attacks by 4% per heavy piece. And Rapid Mending increases your healing received by 1% per heavy piece. Heavy armor also offers inherent bonuses and penalties, independent of the skill point allocation. The bonuses are: each piece of heavy armor reduces damage taken from martial attacks by 1%. Each piece increases your block mitigation by 1%. While immune to crowd control, each piece reduces damage taken by 1%. And the penalties are: each piece of heavy armor increases damage taken from magical attacks by 1%, and each piece increases the cost of roll dodge by 3%. Now moving on to guild skill lines, and starting with the Fighter's Guild. The first skill is Silver Bolts, which is a simple range spammable. It's not really useful on its own. However, it can be morphed into Silver Leash, which is a fundamental skill for tanks. Silver Leash will pull an enemy towards you, snare them, and taunt them if they haven't already been taunted. You'll use it in every trash fight, and in boss fights which include additional adds. Next is Circle of Protection, and once again, we're only interested in its morph, as the base ability offers us basically nothing. Ring of Preservation morph places a circle on the ground for 10 seconds that heals you and your allies inside of it for 1.9% of your maximum stamina or maximum magicka, plus 19.7% of your weapon or spell damage. The heal value is comparable to Mortal Coil, except it takes resources instead of restoring them, and doesn't allow as much movement. But on the plus side, it doesn't consume a corpse, so it can be a decent alternative in fights that don't involve much movement. As for the passives, you'll definitely want the Intimidating Presence, which reduces the stamina cost of your Fighter's Guild abilities by 15%. Slayer passive will increase your weapon and spell damage by 3% for each Fighter's Guild ability slotted. This will boost your healing abilities. Banish the Wicked passive will allow you to get additional ultimate on kills. Getting more ultimate is always nice, but this only works on killing blows, and you won't be getting many of those as a tank. So only get this passive once you have spare skill points. Next up we have Mage's Guild. The first skill we want to look at is Entropy, or rather its morph, Structured Entropy. This skill puts a 20-second damage over time on an enemy, which becomes 24 seconds with the Everlasting Magic passive. Every 2 seconds you'll be healed for 1.9% of your maximum stamina or maximum magicka, plus 19.7% of your weapon or spell damage. What makes this ability really strong is that you can place it on multiple enemies to stack up lots of healing over time on yourself. And even though it isn't a staple ability, I've found it extremely useful in, for example, Dreadcell Reef's first boss. The second skill to mention is Fire Rune. This skill allows you to place a rune on the ground that explodes, dealing flame damage to enemies. While it might not seem particularly useful for tanks at first, it becomes valuable for proccing the Encratis monster set. Encratis increases the flame damage taken by enemies and reduces the flame damage taken by allies. But in order to activate it, you need to deal flame damage yourself. Since weapon enchants cannot proc the set, the easiest way for a Necromancer tank to utilize it is by using Fire Rune. You do have access to flame damage through the Flame Skull, but Fire Rune is much better because of its morph. The Scalding Rune morph will continuously deal flame damage for a duration of 28 seconds. This means you won't have to recast it as frequently to keep Encratis proccing consistently on cooldown. The next skill is Equilibrium, which allows you to trade health for magicka. However, using Equilibrium will reduce the strength of your healing and damage shields by 50% for 4 seconds. You can use it to improve your magicka sustain. The Balance morph grants you Mage Resolve for 30 seconds, which allows you to use this skill as a replacement for Bone Armor, but you don't really want to give up on corpse generating abilities. The Spell Symmetry morph reduces the cost of your next magicka ability by 33%, so it's the better option if you want the additional magicka sustain from Equilibrium, but also want to keep using Bone Armor for the corpses. If you're going to use any Mage's Guild skill, you should get the Mage Adept passive, which reduces the health and magicka cost of Mage's Guild abilities by 15%. The Everlasting Magic passive, which increases the duration of Mage's Guild abilities by 20%, and the Magicka Controller passive, which increases your max magicka and magic recovery by 2% for each Mage's Guild ability slotted. Next we have Psijic Order skill line. The first skill I want to discuss is Time Stop. I have to mention that it's an extremely niche skill, and not a priority to invest a skill point in. Time Stop allows you to stun enemies in an 8-meter radius for 3 seconds. Personally, I found it to be useful only in the Vykosa boss fight, in Moonhunter Keep Dungeon. However, I decided to mention it so you know the option exists, and perhaps you'll find it useful in other situations. If you do decide to use Time Stop, I recommend using the Time Freeze morph to remove the 2-second custom, which can be quite annoying. Moving on, we have Accelerate, which is again rather niche, but absolutely essential in a few fights. Accelerate grants you the Major Expedition buff for 4 seconds, increasing your movement speed by 30%. It also grants Minor Force for 20 seconds, increasing your critical damage by 10%. While the Minor Force buff is not crucial for us as tanks, the reason Accelerate is truly essential is because of its morph, Race Against Time. This morph removes snares and immobilizations, and also provides you with 4 seconds of immunity to them. One fight where this skill is extremely important is when off-tanking Navintas in Sunspire. The statues in that fight will put a stacking snare on you, which eventually becomes so strong you won't be able to move. To counter this, you'll need to use Race Against Time to remove the snare. Additionally, the Major Expedition buff provided by Race Against Time will be very useful in that fight. Expunge can also cleanse this snare, but unlike Race Against Time, it doesn't provide a 30% movement speed bonus from Major Expedition, which is very useful in that fight. And lastly, let's discuss Undo. This ultimate skill allows you to go back in time by 4 seconds, resetting your position, health, stamina and magicka to what they were at that moment. However, you're not meant to use it actively. The reason this ultimate can be useful is because of its morph, Temporal Guard. This morph will passively grant you minor protection while slotted, reducing your damage taken by 5%, and it will also trigger the Concentrated Barrier passive. Now let's take a look at the passives. Clairvoyance reduces the cost of your Psijic abilities by 15%, so you'll want to put points into it if you end up using Race Against Time or Time Freeze. Spell Orb causes you to generate Spell Orb charges for 10 seconds whenever you cast a Psijic ability. After stacking 5 charges, you launch an orb at the closest enemy, which deals a tiny bit of damage. It's not a passive you're going to be able to make use of as a tank, so we can skip it. Concentrated Barrier gives you a 5000 damage shield whenever you begin blocking, if you have a Psijic ability slotted on your bar. The shield recharges when you spend 10 seconds not blocking. It's a nice bonus, so it's a passive worth taking. Deliberation decreases your damage taken by 30% while you're casting or channeling Psijic abilities. However, we're only going to use instant Psijic abilities, so we'd never trigger this passive, so it's useless for us. Now let's move on to the Undaunted skill line. First we have Blood Altar, which is an essential skill to have in every fight. While it doesn't necessarily need to be run by you, someone in your group should use it on every boss fight, as it greatly enhances survivability. When Blood Altar is placed down, every enemy within a 28-meter radius will constantly be afflicted with minor lifesteal. This effect restores 600 health to your allies whenever they attack these enemies, up to once every second. However, the more important aspect of the skill is the synergy it provides. When your allies' health drops to a low level, they can activate the Blood Funnel synergy, healing them for 40% of their maximum health. Like all synergies, it can be used once every 20 seconds. But it gets even stronger. The Overflowing Altar morph instead grants the Blood Feast synergy, which restores 65% of your allies' maximum health when they use it. This can be a lifesaver in many situations. Moving on, we have Trapping Webs. This ability places a web on the ground that deals damage, slows enemies, and explodes after 10 seconds. However, the most crucial aspect is that it grants a single use of the Spawn Broodling synergy to your ranged allies, which summons a spider. Unfortunately, due to the ranged requirement, the synergy is quite niche, as your ally needs to be really far away to activate it. However, in certain situations, like in Asylum Sanctorium, where your allies need to be distant from the main boss, and the main boss has a massive hitbox, they can actually make good use of this synergy. You should use the Shadow Silk morph, as it grants the summoned spider a strong damage over time effect. Next we have Inner Fire. This is the second of the 2 ranged taunts available in the game. It has a range of 28 meters, just like Destructive Clench, but deals flame damage. The additional benefit it provides is a single use of the Radiate synergy for one of your allies, which deals 6% of their max stamina or max magicka, plus 62% of their weapon or spell damage as flame damage over 3 seconds, and then explodes, dealing 10% of their max stamina or max magicka, plus 105% of their weapon or spell damage as flame damage, which makes it the strongest damaging synergy in the game. The Inner Rage morph allows 3 people to use the synergy, which translates into lots of damage done. when your entire group makes use of them. It's also worth recasting this ability early, in 12-man content, to allow even more people to use the synergies. The other wrench node, Destructive Clench, takes priority if your team needs a damage reduction from Major Maim, or if you really need the Minor Brittle, but Inner Rage can be used in easier fights, and when another support takes care of Minor Brittle. Also, if you have enough bar space, you could use both of them. The Inner Beast Morph deals more damage, changes the cost from Magicka to Stamina, changes the damage type from Flame to Physical, and applies Minor Maim and Minor Vulnerability for the duration. It can be a decent source of Minor Vulnerability, if no other support is providing it. The next skill is Bone Shield. It grants you a damage shield equal to 30% of your maximum health, which is identical to the shield you get from the Defensive Stance skill in the One-Handed and Shield skill line. However, Bone Shield also grants your allies a single use of the Bone Wall synergy. When used, this synergy provides them and up to 5 other allies with a damage shield equal to 33% of their maximum health. It's important to note that if you receive the damage shield from someone else using the Bone Wall synergy, it will trigger the 20-second cooldown for you as well. This means that you can't spam Bone Shield and have your allies use it one by one. In content such as 4-man dungeons, if one person activates the synergy, it goes on cooldown for everyone, assuming they were within range to receive the shield. The Bone Surge morph is the better one. It changes the synergy to Spinal Surge, which not only provides the damage shield, but also grants everyone affected by the shield Major Vitality for 6 seconds. Major Vitality increases healing received and strength of damage shields by 12%, and it's a rather rare buff. Bone Surge is an excellent skill to enhance your group's survivability against mechanics that deal significant damage to the entire group, such as for example the Choking Pestilence mechanic from Balstonar Dungeon's final boss, Matriarch Ladi Telvanni. Moving on, we have Necrotic Orb. This skill sends an orb slowly floating forward, dealing damage to all enemies around it. It also provides a crucial synergy to allies, which deals damage and restores 4000 of their dominant resource when activated. The first morph, Mystic Orb, increases all of your recoveries by 100, while the orb is active. The second morph, Energy Orb, transforms the orb and the synergy to heal allies instead of damaging enemies. The synergy is essential for sustaining resources, but most of the time, you won't have to use it yourself, because someone else in the group will already do so. The Necrotic Orb ability itself might not be the best damaging skill, but it's still competitive with others. And healers often use the Energy Orb skill, which means it's typically covered in trials and dungeons, when you have a dedicated healer. Overall, as a tank, it's unlikely that you'll need to slot Necrotic Orb. However, if nobody happens to run it in your group, you can provide significant sustain and damage by using it yourself. As for the passives, the Undaunted command causes you to restore 4% of your max health, stamina and magicka whenever you use a synergy, which is a significant boost to your sustain. The Undaunted Metal passive increases your max health, stamina and magicka by 2% for each type of armor you're wearing, which is why most of the time you'll want to use 5 heavy, 1 medium and 1 light to get the full benefit from this passive. Next up we have the Assault skill line. It's worth noting that all skills from the skill line will proc the powerful Assault item set, which is a set very commonly used by tanks, especially when off-tanking. First skill is Vigor. It grants you and your allies in an 8-meter radius a 10-second heal over time effect. It's a decent heal, especially in a trial environment, where your weapon damage will be buffed by other supports. It's also the skill you'll be using to proc the powerful Assault set, most of the time. The first morph, Resolving Vigor, doesn't heal your allies anymore, heals you for a higher amount in half the time, and grants you the Minor Resolve buff for 20 seconds, which increases your armor by almost 3000. Minor Resolve is essential, which is why you'll be using this morph most of the time. The other morph, Echoing Vigor, increases the duration from 10 to 16 seconds, and increases the radius from 8 to 15 meters. You can get away with using this morph in fights, which are easy to tank, or if you're getting Minor Resolve from another source. Next skill is Rapid Maneuver. This skill grants you and your allies within 28 meters Major Expedition for 8 seconds, which increases movement speed by 30%. Keep in mind that this skill is very expensive and costs 6426 stamina without any modifiers. The morph you'll want to use is Charging Maneuver, which also grants Minor Expedition for the duration, which increases movement speed by another 15%. This morph also has its cost reduced to 6156. I use this skill in trash fights in trials, just so our group can move faster towards the next trash pack. But this is obviously not necessary, and it's just a time saver. There are however places where Charging Maneuver will be actually necessary and not just a time saver. One example is the Lord Falgaran fight in Kain's Aegis trial. There is a mechanic where your team has to run around the arena and form a line in order to transfer a lightning bolt towards the boss in order to interrupt him while he's channeling an ability that will eventually kill your entire team. Charging maneuver is extremely helpful in that phase, and with 28-meter range, you should be able to reach your entire team when timed correctly. Next skill is Caltrops. It places an 8-meter AoE that deals damage and slows enemies inside of it by 50%. The reason you'll want to use it is because one of its morphs, Razor Caltrops, applies major breach to all enemies inside of it, reducing their armor by almost 6000, providing around a 13% damage increase. It's very similar to Unnerving Boneyard, except instead of a synergy, it has an additional slow, and the fact that this skill has a massive delay makes it quite nice to use in trash packs, because you can throw it and then cast another skill before Razor Caltrops even land. And last useful skill from Assault skill line, and a very important one, Warhorn. It costs 250 ultimate and applies a buff to you and all allies within 20 meters. That increases their max stamina and max magicka by 10%. This translates to roughly 300 weapon and spell damage, so it's comparable to the bonus powerful Assault provides. And it gets even better when it's morphed. The aggressive Horn morph also provides major force for 10 seconds, increasing your allies' critical damage down by 20%. It's a massive boost to your group's DPS. As for Assault passives, none of them affect PvE combat, but you'll definitely want to put a single point into continuous attack to get the permanent Major Gallop, which will increase your movement speed while mounted by 30%. Next we have the support skill line. Starting off with Siege Shield. Its morph, Propelling Shield, increases the range of abilities with a range of at least 20 meters by 7 meters while you're standing inside of it. It's going to be really useful in some encounters, such as for example Ansul in Sanity's Edge trial, but it's extremely situational. Next we have Purge. It's a very expensive ability that will cleanse up to 3 effects from you and your allies within 18 meters. It's extremely useful in some places, such as for example the first boss in the Halls of Fabrication trial, Hunter Killer Fabricants. But since you have access to Expunge, it's only useful if you need to help your teammates with cleansing their debuffs. You'll want to use the Efficient Purge morph to make the cost a bit more bearable. Next skill is Guard. This skill allows you to form a link between you and another group member, which transfers 30% of the damage they take to you. The link has a range limit of 50 meters. There will be fights where one of the tanks, usually the main tank but sometimes the off tank, takes significantly more damage than the other. In those fights, the tank with the easier job will guard the other tank to help them survive. One of its morphs, Mystic Guard, also provides constant minor vitality, which increases healing received and strength of damage shields by 6%, and it's quite a rare buff, with very few other sources. Next skill is Revealing Flare, and it's an extremely important skill for a tank. Activating the skill itself exposes invisible enemies which you'll never find useful in PvE, but it also passively grants you major protection, which decreases your damage taken by 10%, which is huge. It's basically trading a skill slot for 10% damage mitigation. And last, we have the Barrier Ultimate. It costs 250 ultimate and grants you and your allies within 12 meters a massive damage shield for 30 seconds. This is the best ultimate when you need to help your group survive, rather than increasing its DPS with the Horn or Colossus. The Replenishing Barrier morph is the better one. The healing you'd gain from reviving Barrier is very small, so it's better to get some ultimate from Replenishing morph to be able to gather enough ultimate for the next barrier faster. As for support passives, you'll absolutely want the Magicka 8. It will increase your Magicka recovery by 10% for each support ability slotted. The other passives are strictly PvP related. Now let's talk about the Vampire skill line. Being a vampire can be situationally very useful, but you need to be aware of its drawbacks. There are 2 ways of utilizing the Vampire skill line. You can stay on stage 1 and gain access to Exhilarating Drain, an ability which is a 3-second channel that generates 20 ultimate. It can be better than generating additional ultimate with Sacrificial Bones, but it requires you to constantly channel, which means you cannot block, which means it's only an option in super trivial fights. Being a vampire will also allow you to use Mist Form, which allows you to dash ahead and absorb projectiles. It can be very useful in some situations. For example, in Cloud Rest, this can entirely absorb Smage's heavy attack. After morphing it to Elusive Mist, you'll also get Major Expedition and Major Evasion for 4 seconds after casting it. Being a stage 1 vampire will increase the cost of all your non-vampire abilities by 3%. increase your flame damage taken by 5%, and decrease your health recovery by 10%. You could also be a stage 3 vampire and also gain access to the undeath passive, which reduces your damage taken by up to 30% based on missing health. Being a stage 3 vampire, however, will increase the cost of your non-vampire abilities by 8%, increase your flame damage taken by 13%, and reduce your health recovery by 60%. It's very strong, but you need to be able to play around the sustain issues it causes. Keep in mind you can switch between vampire and non-vampire using the armory station. You should switch the vampirism off if you don't plan on using accelerating drain or utilizing the undeath passive, so you don't have to deal with the drawbacks. And the very last thing I have to mention regarding skills, or rather passives, you'll actually need one of the passives from craft skill lines, specifically from alchemy. You'll need medicinal use passive to increase the duration of bonuses you gain from potions. And now we've come to the end of the skill descriptions. Now let's move on to creating skill setups for specific encounters. But before we begin, there's been a lot of requests under my previous guide to show a way simpler setup, so I reorganized this part of the video a bit. Let me first show you a setup I would use if I couldn't ever switch my skills. Keep in mind that no matter how casually you want to play, you'll just have to slot Crushing Shock and Immovable for some fights. In those cases, Immovable goes in defensive stances slot, and Crushing Shock goes in instead of Silver Leash or Resolving Vigor. Now let's get back to making more specialized setups. It's important to know that making skill setups will vary greatly between PC and console. PC players have access to add-ons that allow them to instantly swap entire skill setups, either through keybinds or automatically when approaching a specific boss. This means that PC players can specialize their setups for each encounter, while console players will need to create setups that work effectively against both trash mobs and bosses. However, even if you can't make a setup for each specific fight on console, you can sometimes swap your stuff manually when you know you're going up against a more difficult boss fight. So you can still do better than the single setup I've shown at the beginning. Keep in mind that the setups I'm going to show are just suggestions and some base to build off of. You will always get better results by adjusting for each fight, and in the previous part of this video, I mentioned every useful skill for you to choose from. It might seem overwhelming, it is overwhelming, but that's a great thing about ESO, that adds depth to the game and makes it much more enjoyable when you eventually learn it. Let's start off with the trash setup for dungeons. The first, most important skill is obviously Taunt, and we're gonna use Pierce Armor. Next, Razor Caltrops. It's absolutely necessary to keep up Major Breach on all enemies, and it will also slow them down by 50%. It's the skill you'll want to start fights with. You could also use Unnerving Boneyard instead, which doesn't slow, but provides a synergy instead. Next is Necrotic Potency. This will allow you to generate lots of ultimate, and you don't even necessarily need to generate corpses yourself. There will be plenty of dead enemies in trash packs. Next is Power Bash, the skill you'll need to activate the Void Bash item set, which will pull enemies in towards you. You will obviously want to swap it out for something else when not using Void Bash, such as for example Revealing Flare or Defensive Stance, but any skill could go here. And last is Hungry Scythe, your self-heal. It's going to heal for a lot since trash packs have lots of enemies in them. As for the front bar ultimate, we have two options. Temporal Guard will passively grant us minor protection, which is a 5% damage reduction, and it will also trigger the Concentrated Barrier passive. This is the one I'm using, and I think it's best, because it's entirely passive, which means you'll be able to spend your ultimate points entirely with your Bugbear ultimate. The other option is Replenishing Barrier. Even if you don't end up using it, it will provide a passive 10% additional Magicka recovery through the Magicka 8 passive. On Bugbear, we'll start off with Silver Leash. You'll need it to pull enemies in, so that they can die faster in your allies' AoEs. It's also going to be our Wrench Taunt, if we later decide not to use Frost Clench or Inner Rage. Pulsar will chill your enemies, apply Minor Maim, Minor Brittle, and Minor Mangle. It will also apply minor protection to your teammates. You'll need Blockade of Frost, as it will synergize with Pulsar. Blockade will apply Minor Breach, and a 40% slow to all enemies standing inside, who are also chilled. Next we'll need a source of Major Resolve, so we're going to use either morph of Bone Armor. As for the last slot, this one is the most flexible, but I recommend using Inner Rage. It will allow you to taunt enemies from further away, because it has a range of 28 meters, while Silver Leash is only 22. It will help you sustain because you won't have to spend stamina to taunt, and the Radiate synergy will do massive damage, because it explodes in an AoE, and can be used by all of your group members. We could use Resolving Vigor, which is a very strong heal which grants us minor resolve. making it much easier to reach the armor cap. It will also proc the powerful assault set, if you decide to use it. But you can also proc PA by moving your Razor caltrops to Bugbar. We could also use Overflowing Altar, which will greatly increase our group survivability. Although, if you're playing with a healer, they should be the one to use this skill, not you. As for Bugbar ultimate, it's going to depend on the other support in your group. If you're playing with a healer, they are already going to use the aggressive Warhorn, so you should use Glacial Colossus. If you're playing with 3 damage dealers and no healer, you should use aggressive Warhorn yourself instead. Now moving on to boss setups, and here it gets a bit more tricky, and changes a lot depending on the rest of your team. This is the base setup for an environment where you don't trust your teammates to provide anything. So for example when queuing alone with the Dungeon Finder, which by the way I think you absolutely shouldn't do, because it's a trap. The random queue is filled with damage dealers who have zero clue about the game, and you as a tank are in demand, and can very easily get into pre-made groups instead. So what changes compared to the trash setup from before? You swap out your caltrops or Boneyard to Spirit Guardian. This will generate corpses, reduce your damage taken by 10%, heal you or your allies by a tiny bit, and trigger the near-death experience and Undead Confederate passives. The slot where you used Power Bash becomes a very flexible slot, where you could use Sacrificial Bones or Heroic Slash if you want to generate more ultimate, Defensive Stance or Revealing Flare if you need more survivability, or basically any situational skill. Another frontbar ultimate you could use is Renewing Animation. That can help your group recover if multiple people die. In the slot where we used Pulsar, now we're going to use one of the 2 range taunts, Destructive Clench or Inner Rage. Destructive Clench if the boss deals a lot of damage directly, or if we need the Minor Brittle, and Inner Rage otherwise. It is possible to once again get away with other range taunt, but only if you know the fight you're going into very well. In some fights you won't need Silver Leash, and then you can use it as another flex spot. But if you're only making a single boss setup, definitely keep Silver Leash. You won't need it in most fights, but if you end up not having it in a fight with ads, it's gonna cause lots of issues. So that leaves you with 1 or more flex spots. Some fights will straight up require situational skills, like Crushing Shock, Immovable, Revealing Flare, etc. Not to mention being forced to use an assault skill when using the powerful assault set. If you still have empty slots after that, you can use Inner Rage to provide synergies, if you didn't already slot it as your range taunt, Overflowing Altar if you're playing without a healer, Unnerving Boneyard if you need AoE Major Breach and want to provide additional synergy, Skeletal Arcanist if you want even more corpses, Mortal Call if you want more healing and sustain, Shocking Siphon if you're using Elemental Catalyst, etc. I mentioned all the situational skills in the previous part of the video. So now to give you some examples. These would be my builds for last bosses of some dungeons and hard modes. Moonhunter Keep without a healer, and with a healer, Fangler without a healer, and with a healer, Stone Garden without a healer, and with a healer. Now moving on to trials and starting off again with trash setup. I will simply list the changes compared to dungeon boss setup, so I don't have to repeat myself as much. A double Ice Staff setup is better here, but first let me show you a setup with Sword and Board. In the back bar flex spot, you'll want to use Pulsar, and in the front bar flex spot, you'll want to use Caltrops or Unnerving Boneyard. It's better to use a double Ice Staff setup, because this way you can use a charged Ice Staff front bar to amplify Pulsar, and an infused Ice Staff back bar to amplify your Crusher enchant. So in this situation, you'll want to move Pulsar front bar instead of Pierce Armor, and you'll gain a flex spot in your back bar. I also like to swap Boneyard / Caltrops with the range taunt in that case, because having the only taunt be on front bar feels more natural, but that's just a personal preference. Now moving on to trial boss setups. This is going to be extremely similar to boss dungeon setup. First difference would be that you absolutely won't need Overflowing Altar in trials, because you'll always have a healer in those. Once again, you can support your group better with a double Ice Staff setup. But there's one difference compared to trash setup. It's usually easier to survive with a Sword and Board, because you can get your stamina back by heavy attacking, and you can utilize skills such as Defensive Stance or Pierce Armor combined with Puncturing Remedy. Trash packs are usually trivial compared to bosses, so personally I just use Ice Staves there and forget about any new ones. But for bosses, you really should think about what you're going up against, and consider if maybe using a Sword and Board will be better for a specific fight. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a Sword and Board setup, and if you do want to use double Ice Staves, you'll want to remove Pierce Armor, but then you'll need Major Breach from another source, like Elemental Susceptibility, Unnerving Boneyard, or another group member. Once again, I also like to move my range stones to the front bar in that case, but it's not necessary. Other than that, everything I've said about situational skills in the dungeon boss setup section of this video applies here, so I won't be repeating that. But I'll show you a few examples. These will be my builds for bosses of some trials and hard modes. For main tanking Flame Herald Basse, also that's the type of fight where I would use stage 3 Vampirism. For main tanking Zelvaka, and for main tanking Yolnacrin. And that's it for the skill setup part of this video. Just a friendly reminder, the key to getting better results is to adjust your skills based on the situation. There are a bunch of things you need to consider when setting up your skills, like who's in your team and the type of enemy you're facing. So don't forget about all those niche skills that come in handy only in specific situations. Experiment a bit and see what works best for you. Now moving on to gear. I'm gonna talk about armor weight, traits and enchants. Then the same for weapons, and then the same for jewelry. I'll talk about item sets later. One very important thing for console players. Once again, you're at a disadvantage because you won't be able to quickly switch your gear with add-ons. So simply use the boss gear everywhere, and don't optimize for trash at all. So other than the armor passives I've talked about before, the 3 armor tabs provide different amounts of armor, with heavy providing the most, then medium, and then light. The armor value also varies depending on the body part the armor goes on. A chest piece provides the most armor, then legs, head, shoulder and boots provide the same amount, and then gloves and belt provide the least armor. You'll want to always use at least one piece of every armor type to trigger the Undaunted Metal passive from the Undaunted skill line. So most of the time you'll be wearing 5 heavy, 1 medium and 1 light. You'll be able to fit in 2 5-piece item sets and a single 2-piece monster set that comes only in the form of head and shoulder pieces. It's easier to work on examples. So let's say we're using 2 heavy 5-piece sets, Turning Tide and Pearlescent Ward, and we're using Archdruid as our monster set. In this scenario, which is the most common one, these are the weights you're going to use. You're basically forced into heavy on 5 of those pieces, but you can use any weight you want on your head and shoulder, so you'll want light and medium to get the full value of Undaunted Metal. Changing the medium piece to light will reduce your magical damage taken, thanks to the light armor bonuses, but also reduce your maximum resources, including max health, because of the Undaunted Metal passive. So this approach can make sense against magic damage that scales with max HP, such as the Basse fight, but it's still better to keep the single medium piece against magic damage that doesn't scale with max HP, such as in the fight against Maja. It's impossible to show you all the combinations because there's so many variables, but let me show you 2 more examples. Let's say you're wearing Turning Tide, Olorim, and once again Archdruid. In this setup, you could shift the weights a bit and have your belt be light, because the belt provides very little armor anyway, so the difference between heavy and light is 516, while for head and shoulder, the difference between heavy and light is 1204, and you're able to have a light belt because one of your body sets is Olorim. The second example is the same, but instead of Olorim we have Powerful Assault, which is a medium set. I hope this gives you the idea. Now let's move on to traits. Out of 10 traits, we're only gonna look at 6 of them. Reinforced, which increases items armor by 16%. Nirnhound, which increases items armor by 253. Divines, which increases Mundus stone effects by 9.1%. I haven't talked about Mundus stones yet, but all you need to know for now is that this 9.1% translates into 27 additional magic recovery. Invigorating, which increases health, stamina and magic recoveries by 16. Sturdy, which reduces the cost of block by 4. And Well-Fitted, which reduces the cost of roll dodge by 6%. The first step is getting enough Reinforce and Nirnhound pieces to reach the armor cap. A Reinforce becomes better than Nirnhound on pieces which have a base armor value higher than 1581. There is also a lot of other variables that will have an impact on our armor, such as race, item set bonuses, champion points, or weapon type. After you fit the armor cap, Divines is the best default trait to put on the remaining pieces. And by default I mean it's the best all-around trait that's useful in every situation. Sturdy is situationally best for some encounters, where you're forced to hold block for a long time, such as for example the Valiant and Lamikai boss in Scrivener's Hall dungeon, or basically any trash fight. Sturdy can also be good for beginner players, who are mindlessly holding block even when there's no need to, or when you're using the Wardmaster slottable champion point, which kind of forces you into this perma-blocking gameplay to benefit from the damage reduction. If you're going to dabble in every type of content, I feel like Divines is the better default trait, but if you're going to target something specific, such as Infinite Archive, where you'll be fighting a lot of trash mobs, you should consider using Sturdy as your default trait, rather than Divines. Although the most difficult trial encounters happen to favor Divines over Sturdy. Well Fitted can be situationally best for some specific encounter, where you're forced to dodge roll a lot, such as for example the Reef Guardian boss in Dreadcell Reef Trial. Invigorating is not far behind Divines in terms of magic recovery, and it also gives you some stamina recovery, so it's a viable option if you know you'll be using Stone Giant a lot. Now these would be the traits I would use on a Necromancer tank with no additional armor from item set bonuses, but with Fortified and Bulwark champion points, minor resolve buff from Resolving Vigor, and a one-handed and shield front bar. If I were for example an Imperial, I would need to make up for the missing armor, which I would get from North Racial in previous setup. I could do that by changing my Mundus stone to the Lady, which grants 2744 armor. I would lose a lot of magical recovery, but Lady would offset missing out on North's Rugged passive, which grants 2600 armor. So we could go back to the trait setup I presented for North, though with Lady Mundus, Divines isn't giving you magical recovery anymore, it's giving armor, so you should use Invigorating or Sturdy in its stead. Now going back to the first setup I've shown, when you want to use the situational traits, like Sturdy or Well Fitted, you'd simply swap out Divines or Invigorating pieces to those, and keep Reinforced and Nenhout the way they are, as reaching the armor cap is extremely important. Keep in mind some sets, like for example Crimson Oath, provide armor with their set bonuses, which makes getting to the armor cap much easier, and allows you to give up armor in other parts of your build, such as champion points for example. I hope that gives you the idea, because usually there will be more variables, so the setups I just showed you won't be enough. Now let's move on to enchants. There are 4 types of enchants you can put on your armor: Health, Stamina, Magicka, and Tristat. Body enchants are simple and there's no situational stuff. Tristats are straight up best, but they're also very expensive. So before you can afford them, you'll want to use a mix of Health, Stamina, and Magicka enchants, so that you get roughly similar amounts of all 3 of them. Enchants on chest, legs, helm, and shield provide more, so prioritize those when upgrading to Tristats. Now we're moving on to weapons. Weapons obviously don't have weights, but they have types, and that's what we're going to start off with. As a tank, you'll be using either a one-handed weapon with a shield or an ice staff on your front bar. On your back bar, you'll always be using ice staff. So how to decide which one to use in a certain situation? When it comes to trash pack setups, it's very simple. You want to use one-handed shield in dungeons to utilize the Void Bash item set, and in trials you want to use ice staff, so you can use Pulsar on your front bar. But against bosses, the choice isn't as clear. So let's compare the differences between one-handed shield and frost staff. One-handed and shield gets 5% weapon and spell damage, increased block mitigation against projectiles by 14%, increased movement speed while blocking. You can regenerate both stamina and magicka with heavy attacks, because you'll have one-handed and shield on front bar and ice staff on back bar. You gain access to defensive stance, which is a decent damage shield that costs stamina, and a shield will grant you 1720 armor, a body enchant, and an armor trait. A frost staff gets 100% increased chance to apply status effects, and you gain double the value of a weapon trait and weapon enchant compared to one-handed and shield. The importance of a chance to apply status effects depends on your team comp. It can be useful because shock damage has a chance to apply minor vulnerability, and frost damage has a chance to apply minor brittle. But these 2 debuffs can be much more easily provided by arcanists, who simply have to use a skill every 20 seconds. Another thing to consider is that if you're double barring ice staves, you'll most likely have the Destructive Clench skill on your front bar, which makes it easier to keep up Major Maim, which lasts only 5 seconds. And the last thing to consider is that you can generate more ultimate with an ice staff, because your decisive trait, if you decide to use it, will be twice as effective. So in the end, one-handed and shield is the easier to place choice, with better survivability, while ice staff offers better group support. If you're unsure about some encounter, you should first go with a one-handed and shield setup, since not dying is the number 1 priority. Now let's move on to traits. Out of 8 traits, we're only gonna look at 4 of them. Charged increases chance to proc stats effects by 117.5% and 235% if it's a two-handed weapon. Decisive gives you a 27.5% chance to gain 1 additional ultimate whenever you gain ultimate, and the chance is 55% if it's a two-handed weapon. Infused increases effective weapon enchantments by 30% and it decreases their cooldown by 50%. And defending increases your armor by 1638 or 3276 if it's a two-handed weapon. So let's go over all content types and what kind of trades you should use there. In trash bags and dungeons, you'll absolutely want your bugbear ice staff to be charged, so that your pulsar almost always applies the chilled stats effect. As for your front bar, you'll want to use decisive to generate more ultimate. In trash bags and trials, you'll want your bugbear ice staff to be infused to boost your crusher enchant, and your front bar ice staff to be charged, so that your pulsar always applies the chilled stats effect. If you're using one-handed and shield, you should instead apply the logic from dungeon trash packs. So charged bugbear with decisive front bar. Against bosses both in dungeons and in trials, you'll absolutely want your bugbear ice staff to be infused to boost your crusher enchant. Your front bar weapon should be infused with weakening enchant if you're playing without a healer, and decisive otherwise. You could also utilize charged with shock enchant to provide minor vulnerability. Defending is something you can use on your front bar weapon to massively help with reaching the armor cap, although it's gonna create an armor disbalance between your front bar and back bar. It's not something you're ever going to need as a Nord, but it can be good if you're going to choose a different race, but we'll get to that later. Now moving on to enchants. There's a lot of those, but I'll only talk about a few most useful ones. Keep in mind that these values will be halved when put on a one-handed weapon. Crusher reduces enemies' armor by 1622 for 5 seconds, and it has a 10-second cooldown. With the infused trait and elemental blockade, you can keep it up indefinitely. Shock deals 2534 shock damage, and it has a 4-second cooldown. The reason you'll want to use it is because damage from enchants has a very high base chance to proc stats effects, 20%, and with all other modifiers, such as charge trait on your weapon, you'll be able to reach chance close to 100%. And shock damage procs the concussed stats effect, which applies minor vulnerability for 4 seconds. Frost deals 2534 frost damage, and it has a 4-second cooldown. Same reasoning as with shock, except here we're talking about the chilled stats effect, which applies minor maim, and, if you're wielding an ice staff, minor brittle. Weakening reduces enemies' weapon and spell damage by 348 for 5 seconds, and it has a 10-second cooldown. With the infused trait, you'll be able to keep up decent uptime on it. Hardening grants 3784 damage shield for 5 seconds, and it has a cooldown of 10 seconds. Absorb stamina, absorb magicka, and prismatic onslaught. These deal 1900 physical or magic damage, and restore 354 stamina, 354 magicka, or 177 magicka and stamina respectively. So let's go over all content types and what kind of enchants you should use there. Basically, you'll want to always use Crusher on your backbar weapon. In trash bags, your front bar enchant doesn't really matter. You can use Shock, Weakening, Hardening, or one of the sustain enchants. Against bosses, you'll want to use the Weakening enchant, if you don't have a healer with you. Or Shock if nobody else is providing minor vulnerability. If you have a healer and have minor vulnerability covered, you can use some selfish enchant of your choice. Hardening for damage shields, or one of the sustain enchants. One more situational thing I want to mention is that sometimes in very organized groups, against very difficult bosses, you can use a hardening enchant on your backbar instead of Crusher, and it will increase your survivability by a decent amount, but you have to make sure other supports will cover Crusher instead. Now let's talk about jewelry and start with listing all the useful traits. Infused increases effectiveness of jewelry enchantments by 60%. Harmony restores 880 health, stamina and magicka whenever you activate a synergy. Swift increases movement speed by 7%. And Protective increases armor by 1190. In trash fights, the best trait is Swift. The movement speed is really useful there, and trash is usually easy to deal with, so you don't need the additional sustain from Harmony or Infused. Keep in mind that the case is different in Infinite Archive, as the trash there isn't trivial, so you should treat it basically like a boss fight. Especially since a boss could spawn any moment while you're doing Infinite Archive trash. Against bosses you'll want to use Infused or Harmony. And if I were to simplify the relation between them, it would be that Harmony is stronger whenever you have at least 2 different synergies available to you, which means that Harmony will be better in the vast majority of situations. But Infused can be better when playing with randoms, or if the specific encounter makes it really difficult for your teammates to provide you synergies. But that's just a big shortcut, and if you want to learn more, I made a separate video about it. Protective is something I listed as a last resort for reaching the armor cap. Using it will hurt your sustain by quite a bit, but it's still better than going into a very difficult fight without being armor capped. Let's move on to jewelry enchants, and I'll once again list all the useful ones. Reduce spell cost reduces magicka cost of all abilities by 203, reduces skill cost, reduces health, stamina and magicka cost of all abilities by 133, and bracing, reduces block cost by 203. And it's very simple here which one you'll want to use. Reduced skill cost is the best one if you're going to frequently use some stamina skill, such as defensive stance. Otherwise, reduced spell cost is the best one. Bracing engine is good while you're still learning the game, and you're holding block even when there's no need to. It's also situationally good in some encounters, such as for example trash fights in the Infinite Archive. Now item sets. You're able to fit onto yourself 2 5-piece item sets and a single 2-piece monster set. There's tons of them, but fortunately I already made a separate video for those. Here's the video for 5-piece sets, and here a video for monster sets. Some of the 5-piece item sets can be one-barred, which means that you can wear 3 of its pieces on body or jewelry, and the last 2 pieces on your weapon slots. Doing so with a single 5-piece item set will allow you to fit in a 2-piece weapon set on one of your bars. Here are the sets you could use in that case. Puncturing Remedy, if you're using Pierce Armor, Defensive Position, if you're using Defensive Stance, and Void Bash. Absolutely great for trash packs and dungeons. You'll need Power Bash to proc it, which I already put in the dungeon skill setup, specifically for this set. Here's an example of such setup. If you were to one-bar both of your 5-piece sets, and have one of them work only on your front bar, and the other one only on your back bar, you can't fit in weapon sets anymore, but you'd be able to fit in 2 more items on your body or jewelry. In this situation, it's best to use a mythic and 1 piece of the trainee set. It's also worth noting that trainee comes in any weight, which gives you some flexibility. There are a few useful mythics for tanking. The 2 useful for your team are Spodder of Ruin and Crypt Cannon's Vestment, but since Spodder of Ruin is a shoulder piece, it's more convenient to sort of put it in the monster sets category, as it will replace a monster set if you decide to use it. Crypt Cannon's Vestment can be pretty strong, but it requires coordination with the rest of your group, so don't bother bringing it into pug runs. The 2 selfish mythics I can recommend are Death Dealer's Fete, but it will be a detriment if a fight has damage that scales with max HP, and Marked Ring of Majesty. It can be a really good source of additional armor. Here is an example of such setup. Now let's talk about the gear you should start with. This is the crafted setup you could start with. I'm saying you could because you don't have to start with crafted gear. Turning Tide and Crimson Oath are 2 very good sets that come from dungeons. And normal difficulty dungeons are relatively easy, so if you want you can skip the crafted set phase and go farm these dungeons while wearing some random gear you've got from questing. To make everything a bit more clear, now I want to show a few examples of full gear sets I would use for some encounters. For dungeons without a healer, this is what I'd use in Trash, and this is what I'd use against bosses. For dungeons with a healer, this is what I would use in Trash, and this is what I'd use against bosses. For Pack Trials, this is what I would use as a main tank, and this is what I'd use as an off tank. While both of these setups have Saxhleel, you won't really need 2 of them in a group. I put them in both setups because of the set synergy with Glacial Colossus, and these setups are my suggestions for very unorganized and chaotic pack runs, where you can't be sure what anyone else is wearing. You can also bring penetration sets, like Crimson Oath and Tremor Scale, which will be super beneficial for damage dealers who don't have enough penetration as a part of their own build, but they will be useless for damage dealers who have enough penetration on their own, like for example Arcanists. There really is no good way around making a build for random groups, so don't think too much about it. In organized groups, you will simply wear whatever your raid lead tells you to. Now moving on to champion points. Just like with every other aspect of this game, a lot of the stuff here will be situational, and you'll be able to gain small bits of advantage here and there by reconfiguring and preparing for each fight on its own, but I will also include lazy setups. The green tree doesn't impact combat, but I just want to mention that the Steed's Blessing Saltable, which increases your out of combat movement speed by 20%, is a very good one to have for moving between trash packs. This is the order in which you should progress your blue tree. The useful blue Slaughterables are Ironclad, which reduces damage taken from direct damage attacks by 6%, Unassailable, which reduces damage taken from damage over time attacks by 6%, Duelist's Rebuff, which reduces damage taken from single target attacks by 6%, Enduring Resolve, which reduces damage taken from area of effect attacks by 6%, Bulwark, which increases your armor by 1900 while you have a shield or frost staff equipped, which should be at all times anyway, and Focused Mending, which increases your single target healing by 10%. It can boost your Resolving Vigor and Hungry Scythe. If you don't want to think too much about it, the general best setup is Ironclad, Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, and Bulwark. But you can get a lot more out of it by adjusting to the situation. So here's a few tips on how to set it up. You'll want to use all slotables that correspond with the type of damage you'll take in a specific encounter. For some you'll have to use all 4 of them, but for most of them 3 will be enough, which enables you to use Bulwark to increase your armor by a fair bit. This enables you to shift armor somewhere else. For example, you could use different armor traits, different skills, or you could use Focus Mending to boost your healing. Red Tree is the more complicated one. This is the order in which you should progress it. Useful red slotables are Mundus Vitality, which increases your max health by 1400, Fortified, which increases your armor by 1731, Rejuvenation, which increases your health, stamina and magic recovery by 90, Celerity, which increases your movement speed by 10%, Bastion, which increases the strength of your damage shields by 15%, Shieldmaster, which decreases the cost of your damage shields by 10%, Bracing Anchor, which increases your block mitigation by 20% and reduces your movement speed by 16%, Wardmaster, which reduces your damage taken by 10% while blocking under the effect of a damage shield, Sustained by Suffering, which increases your health, stamina and magical recovery by 150 while you have a debuff on yourself, and On Guard, which increases your block mitigation by 10% while under the effects of crowd control immunity. And some extremely niche ones, but ones I still want to mention, are Arcane Alacrity, which reduces cost of your dodge roll by 800 while under the effect of a damage shield, and Expert Evasion, which grants you a free dodge roll once every 30 seconds. If you don't want to think too much about it, the general best setup is Mundus Vitality, Fortified, Bracing Anchor and Rejuvenation, but you can get a lot more out of it by adjusting to the situation. So here's a few tips on how to set it up. Wardmaster will drain your stamina by forcing you to permablock, but it can be worth it in fights with absurd incoming damage that normally isn't affected by block, such as for example Flame Herald Basse. Though, since Necromancer doesn't have access to magicka damage shields, your only option is defensive stance, which combined with permablocking to proc Wardmaster will kill your stamina, so it's very difficult to pull off. Bastion will boost shield values of your defensive stance and barrier ultimate, if you choose to use them. Shieldmaster can reduce their cost, which is very useful for barrier, since it's reducing the ultimate cost. Bracing Anchor is great for fights with constant direct blockable damage. Celerity is great for fights where you have to constantly move around. It can also be used to offset Bracing Anchor's movement speed penalty. On Guard will synergize with Immovable if you choose to use it, granting you even more block mitigation during that 6-second window. Mundus Vitality is great for your survivability, if a fight does not have max HP base damage. Fortified will help you reach the armor cap, and you're going to need it most of the time, unless you're wearing some gear that specifically grants you lots of additional armor, like Mark and Ring of Majesty or Crimson Oath. Rejuvenation is a decent boost to sustain when you have a slot left. Sustained by Suffering is a straight up stronger rejuvenation that only works in some fights, but there's decent amount of fights where you'll have a constant debuff on yourself. Now let's talk about the race. Sadly, the game isn't very balanced here, and you'll be handicapping yourself by a decent amount by not choosing North for their bonus armor, because armor is very hard to get from other sources. It is possible to obtain, but that forces you to sacrifice other good stuff, such as the Atronach Mundus or Sustained Jewelry traits. Then there's also North's ultimate generation passive, which at first glance might seem similar to Imperial's cost reduction passive, but North's ultigen passive works better with sets like Saxhleel or War Machine, which are quite commonly worn on tanks. You can still make it work, it's just going to be harder to play. You still gotta make sure to be armor capped against the more difficult encounters, even if it means giving up the Atronach Mundus for Lady or giving up Sustained Jewelry traits for Protective. If you want to learn the differences between each race in more detail, I made a separate video about it. Now moving on to Munduses. This part is actually very straightforward, because the best Mundus stone by far is the Atronach, which grants 310 magic recovery. You can find it in the places shown on the screen. It can also be placed in houses, so some guild halls might have it there. You can also use the Lady Mundus, which I mentioned multiple times when talking about race. Lady Mundus increases your armor by 2744. As for attributes, most of the time it's best to put all your points into health. It will increase your survivability and increase the scaling on most of your abilities. Having bigger resource capacity is useful, but not at the cost of health. The only exception is when your max magicka would be higher than your max stamina, due to, for example, racials or item set bonuses. In that case, you should put just enough points into stamina so that your max stamina is higher than your max magicka, so that it's considered your dominant resource, for the sake of combustion synergy. The best food is Orzorga's smoked bear haunch, which will increase your max health and all recoveries. There's also a cheaper alternative called Jewels of Misrule, which provides only slightly less stats. Sometimes it will be beneficial to lower your max health, for example during the execute phase in Cloudrest. Candied Jester's Coin is one example of a food that's good for that. Most of the time you'll want to use the Tri-Stat potions, which will store all of your resources and boost their recoveries by 30%. You can craft them by combining Columbine, Baglos, and Mountain's Flower. A better alternative, though much more expensive, are Heroism potions, which boost your ultimate generation instead of restoring health. You can craft them by combining Columbine, Dragon's Blood, and Dragon Realm. And that's it for this video. If you have any more questions, you can comment down below, or join our Discord server Wildheart. As always, feedback will be appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel and check out my Twitch. Thanks for watching and see you next time.